Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast, and we have with us today Bruno. But Bruno, before we take off, are you prepared to engage?
Yes.
Let's do this because we have Bruno Setola with us today. Setola, I hope I said that kind of right. Yeah?
Well, this is a question you ask all your guests, I've heard, like, do I pronounce it the right way? And I would say I'm collecting from now on the various ways in which you can pronounce my name. So,
interesting.
In your own way?
Setola is the first thing that came to my mind, to be honest.
All right. Well, that's very much like Dutch people would pronounce it. In Italy, they would say Setola.
Setola, yeah. In Spanish, since there's no accent, which determines where do you put your emphasis, the O would be the place that would get sort of the accent. So you would say Setola in Spanish. If you had it in the A, it would be Setola, or Setola if you said it said the accent on the E. So those are the ones I can help you with.
Okay, I'll gladly add both of them to my collection.
Fantastic. So we have Bruno, who describes himself as a game thinker. He looks at daily interactions between people as games and aims to make them more fun, fair, and engaging, just like you just saw with his last name's pronunciation, for sure. And he's constantly helping organizations reimagine the rules of their game. There's always a participatory process in which he involves the players to apply the best ideas from games in order to redesign the game of living, learning, and working together. And he's been a consultant for over 10 years with hands-on experience in applied game design, while also researching and teaching gamification at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences. So, Bruno, is there anything we're missing, anything we should be mentioning before we take off?
No, that's pretty much it. That sums it up nicely. Thank you.
Amazing. So, Bruno, can you tell us, what does a regular day with you look like? How does it feel to be Bruno nowadays?
Yeah, how does it feel to be Bruno nowadays? Big question. Oh, well, a regular day, so if I'm not teaching, running a workshop, or meeting a client, then a typical day for me goes something like this. So I go to my office, I pick up a book or something to do with games or play, and then I read it, and then I start to think about, how can I turn what I just learned into some kind of interactive experience? And usually I use cards, like blank cards, and start creating card sets around this, to try to sort of structure what I've just learned into something that becomes modular or playable. And, I don't really know yet what it's going to be, but just that I want to sort of condense all that into something simple. And then I can get really addicted to this process, and I can literally spend 3-4 days on end, while I eat, drink, sit on the toilet. I'm constantly obsessing with this until I've sort of figured it out and it all clicks together. And then I create this prototype. So usually a card set and some basic game rules. And then I put it aside. I'm like, okay, I did that. And then I repeat the process. Sometimes I take a little break, have a coffee, and then jump, from one obsession to the other in a way.
So you're basically going from the previous game to the next one, it seems.
Yes. And this is purely, from my own intrinsic motivation. So really from a passion to learn new things and turn them into something useful or inspiring. Sometimes I don't know yet what use it will have. So then, for instance, I have coffee with one of my friends or, other designers or even a client, and I show them this prototype and I go like, I just made this. Like literally today I sat with some colleagues and said, I just made this and I think I can use this to create maybe 10 different sorts of workshops for different contexts. What do you think? Where will this be useful? Who should I be talking to? So it's really, that's the ideal approach. But this is something, that's why it's a bit of a tough question. This is what I'm doing now lately, like let's say the last half year. It hasn't always been like that. I was educated as a designer, really. And what a designer does, obviously, is sort of sit around all day, wait for a client to give you a briefing, and then you start, the brain work, and you start prototyping, etc. Like, you don't start before you got a job, but to really do that because you feel the need that something should exist, but you don't know yet why, but you have a gut feeling that this will be super useful or some universal tool.
Hmm.
That's something that I always did like after work. So I would have like a job, like in a studio. I worked at a design studio, and you work 9 to 5, and then 5 to 9, basically, or whatever you want to call it. I would then start thinking, okay, what do I want to make for myself? This is usually born out of a frustration or simply questioning, like, what if we would change the rules of this? And then I would do all these things, but I would just file them away in folders, a little bit like I do now, but then not really take that seriously and think, well, that's just something I do for myself. And then I would just go back to being a designer in the daytime. And it's only since a year or so that a lot of my friends, or like really good friends and colleagues for a long time, have said, why don't you finally change that around and make what you do, which is super valuable, your core work, and basically, make clients something you do on the side. And that's where I find myself now, and it's quite challenging because it's so easy to click back into this. Oh, but if there's not really a client for it, then there's no point in doing it. And I guess they're sort of beating that out of me in a very loving and caring way, if you know what I mean.
And I'm getting curious. Like, what do you do with those designs and those things that you do create?
Well, so for instance, I made motivation cards. Like, what are the 10 core motivations of players, right? And not just in board
Okay.
games or video games, but even in LARPs and stuff like that. So I analyze a lot of these, player type theories, although I don't believe in player types, but more in, let's say, things that
Don't tell
players
Ante.
like to do. Yeah, I mean, I know his user type Hexad, of course. I mean, there's so many. There's Imijo Kim. There's, well, there's so many of them, and you cannot really make one model out of it that works, and you cannot prove scientifically that this is true. Like, I'm a big fan of Sebastian Deterding, and he's basically not a big fan of these player type ideas. But you got to start somewhere, right? So intuitively, I just made these 10, like connect, explore, escape, belong, improve, immerse, compete, express, achieve, and collaborate, like 10 core things that motivate players. And then I was like, okay, those are 10 different things that seem to make people interested in playing. And the good thing is that brought me beyond the, competition and winning type of ideology. But I was like, now what? So then I showed it to my colleague, Eric Hille, and said, look, I got these 10 player types. I can build like lots of workshops around it. But what do you think? So then he goes like, well, why don't we use that, for instance, in this client I have, and they have 2 departments that are arguing with each other, but they seem to take it from very different perspectives. So we showed them these cards and asked them what kind of player type, well, not player type, but what motivates you to do your job professionally. And then it came to the light, for instance, one says, well, I'm very competitive. That really drives me. And the other one was like, no, collaboration. And you're like, okay. And this was for a big museum, so it was quite interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then these 2 departments started to have conversations around these themes. And, well, I cannot say too much about this project in particular because it's quite sensitive subject matter, of course, if these struggles happen within an organization. But these cards really brought to the forefront what drives their behavior. And once you know that, you can take it into account. So one of the things that really surprised me was that the person that said that she was very competitive also found another person that said, yes, I'm very competitive. And then they said to the other person, and I know you really like working with me because you're also very competitive. And then that person said, no, I'm not. I'm always playing along, but I actually hate it when you do that. And I was like, oh, really? That becomes really interesting. And then they're like, no, if you would leave it to me, I would want to explore more, but you're so goal driven that I just, go with whatever you're doing. But if we could explore a bit further, I think we could do even better work, if you were not so focused on achieving, being the first one at the end. And that got them to really see each other's strengths and weaknesses.
Interesting. So it's a bit serendipitous in a way. designing and seeing if there's a place in the world for that, which is amazing. That's cool.
Yeah. And I guess the more you do this, the more you start looking at, well, one thing I'm now really obsessing over is, have you heard about nonviolent communication?
Yeah.
This is, from Marshall Rosenberg. And so what is interesting, he talks about, well, let's not go too much into the theory, but the bottom line is, let's not judge each other. So let's not say you make me feel a certain way. Let's just say I feel a certain way and there's a need behind it. And I'll let you know my needs. And then I'll give you the choice if you want to meet my needs or not, which is a much more respectful way than saying, you make me feel shit, you better change your behavior, right? How do you start up a dialogue like that? It can be very sensitive. And if I looked at nonviolent communication, you have a whole workbook of games. I don't know if you noticed, but I ordered it. And I didn't like these games at all. I was like, that's really nice, but it felt too, how can I say, too hippie-like for me. Like it didn't feel like I could go to an organization and have these really emotional talks that way. So I was like, I want to have a shortcut. I want to have a way in which I can go straight from the I feel disrespected, which is not an emotion, but it's a judgment, into what is my need, and then into can you help me meet my needs? So into a more respectful conversation. So what I did lately is I translated all these, say, fake needs, they call them jackal needs, like not actual needs, into cards. And then on the back of this card, I connected them to the universal needs. So there was there's a lot of models for universal human needs, but there was one from TU Delft, the research that put all these models together into some sort of 13 universal needs that I thought, okay, this will really work for me, is sort of more design oriented. And I put them on the back. So if you flip that card over from what frustrates you, you immediately get, this is probably what I need. So then I had people play it and express their frustrations, let's say the dark side of the card. And they go like, hey, yeah, these are my 3 top frustrations in our teamwork. And I flip them over and I say, so does that mean that these 3 constitute your actual needs? And they go like, yeah, how do you know? I'm like, yeah. And then we can immediately start talking about those needs. So the conversation immediately becomes positive and something that we can actually build upon instead of discussing endlessly why you feel that way so bad, because that doesn't always necessarily lead to a solution.
Sounds good. Sounds good. And Bruno, I think that was a very neat story of success, and how you found success creating this thing and how it's working. But I would like to take the opposite route in this case. I would like to find of one of those times where you were trying to do something and you could call it a fail or a first attempt in learning, your favorite failure. But basically one of those times where, as you were mentioning before, you got frustrated maybe because something was not working. We want to sort of be there with you. We want to learn those lessons as well, and perhaps even and see how you got out of that fail moment.
Well, the thing that comes to mind is I've been teaching also gamification for 10 years, but in the beginning, I didn't know much. I mean, I taught it myself, right? So there was, when I started out, 11 years ago, all there was Gabe Zicherman and Sebastian Deterling, I guess.
Yeah.
Like two, the angel and the devil on my shoulder, but there wasn't really much examples of what you could do, except, of course, points, badges, leaderboards, and achievements. So badges was really the thing then, right? You earning badges. So I thought to myself, I'm going to teach my students and I'm going to design all these badges. So I created this, I have to say, quite beautiful set of achievement badges. I mean, my background is in graphic design, so I made sure it looked, really appealing. And, I sweated over that, like obsessed over that many nights, describing all the possible, I translated all the learning goals and learning attitudes that are best in learning, looking up didactics, and translated to these badges. So if they would earn these badges, they would immediately also make it measurable if they achieved the learning goals, the underlying learning goals. I was like, okay, this is going to work. This is going to work. And I introduced them. And these were students that were into games. I mean, they were playing Red Dead Redemption during class if they could get a chance. So I thought this will really appeal to them. And it was an absolute failure. And the reason why is actually quite simple. And that was an eye-opener. So I introduced it, and they didn't seem to be very interested in getting these achievements. So I was interested. I said, okay. So we play tested a bit, and in a way, like 3 classes down the road, I said, why are you not enthusiastic about it? I want to understand, right? And he said, well, first of all, we never chose to play this. Like, you just brought this in. But most importantly, I'll never forget, they go, education is a serious thing. We don't want to play no games. We want to be taken seriously here. And I was like, but hold on, that's not what Gabe Zickerman said. That's not what the gurus say. Fun makes things fun. Like, add fun, make things that are boring more fun. Like, that's how it works, right? No.
Not really.
You're playing with us. You should take it seriously. I was like, I really didn't get it, right? Like, I had to go back and I was like, how is this possible? I spent so much time on it. I mean, but what they said is literally the lesson I learned, which is you cannot just create a game, throw that on top of people and expect them to like it. They like Red Dead Redemption because they choose to play that game because that's the game they want to play. Plus, they know it's just a game. It's playtime. They chose education because they want a career in it. It's a serious choice that they've thought, shall I be this or this or that? No, I want to be this and I want to take it seriously. Maybe this is not typical. There might be students that are not so serious, but these are some really serious students. So they were like, this is our choice, and we don't want you to change it into a game which we don't want to play. And I think the approach that started to happen right there and then was that I started to, whenever I thought of gamifying something, I would then ask them, I would like to gamify the way this class, for instance, how can we do this? How would you do this? So I would start involving them. And then it did work. Because clearly they got ownership, they got a choice. Like, if they designed something, then they will choose to play it because they designed it themselves, Otherwise, they wouldn't design it for themselves. So not only does it make it more custom designed for themselves, but it's involving them that in the game design. And I think the biggest lesson from that, which I didn't get straight away, it took me about 4 years to realize it, is that the power isn't in the game. The power is in designing the game together. Because if you design, or let's say if you gamify the interactions between people, you have to deconstruct the game of education. You have to understand why it works or doesn't work. Like Jane McConnell says, the game is broken. So why is it broken? What's broken? Then wonder, shall we add a new rule, change a rule, twist a rule? Would that make up for better education? So you treat education as a game. You don't make a game for education, right? And then when you reimagine it, you try it out, you find out what works or doesn't work. So you're basically prototyping education itself, but looking at it from the perspective of a game designer. Once you do that, I felt people were really felt empowered. They had control over the rules of the game. And that gave him ownership, and that gave him a sense of, yes, now I will play this game because I helped redesign this game. But usually when I did it, it always ended up with still a game in a box or something. And at some point I was like, it doesn't matter if I end up with a game or in a box. It's almost like an excuse. Like, if a client now says to me, can you help me with my organization? There's no ownership. People don't feel engaged. I said, I'll design a game with them. And then we designed a game. But in the end, the game, it doesn't matter. Like, that ends up in the shelf anyway,
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Like, have you reused any of those games that you create with people? With other people, of course.
Parts of it, yeah. I think if a game is finished, then I realize what are the interesting parts of it. Maybe we'll get to that later on in the questions. But like, this is an interesting thing. This is an interesting. I can reuse that for another game. But I'll never really like take a game and try to squeeze as much.
You won't play the game with other people then?
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay, interesting.
But I guess the big insight was it isn't about the final game. It's about the design process that makes people engaged. And it still sounds maybe strange when I say it, but it's something I have to remind myself of all the time, because, the pitfall is to think we reimagine the game, right? Like, I created a whole new gamified approach for this class with them, and they're excited and they're engaged. The error in my head has always been, all right, if it works for this class, it will work for the next class. No, it won't work. Not because they wouldn't enjoy it, but because they weren't part of the design process of it. And that's a big difference. You know what I'm saying?
Lots of food for thought there, Bruno. Engagers, listen to these words. Plenty of stuff to sit down and reflect and think about. And talking about reflecting, and you've given us at least some clues about what this might look like. But when you sit and do these things with your students or with a client, you sit down to create a game with them. Do you have a process? Do you follow some steps? Or how does it work, basically?
Yeah. Well, there's sort of a core, let's say, process, which sounds very linear, but it's never exactly that linear. I mean, first of all, start with some sort of warm up, not only to get them into the mood, but also to create some safety, like lower the threshold, explain to them that we're going to, reimagine your interactions, your daily interactions. But that's a threat, right? I mean, I'm going to basically say we're going to reimagine how your daily life goes or your daily job goes. That can sound very like a threat. So I'll say to them, just a game or these sort of gameful activities that I create are creating the safety to try out alternate realities. And if we don't like them in the end, so be it. But if great ideas come out of it, hey, all the better. So, don't worry, we have basically a license to explore new ideas, but don't feel threatened just yet, because it's not guaranteed what comes out of it will be your new reality. And what I really like to usually do to get them into the mood of the core loop, the game design loop, which is, to ideate, to prototype, to play test, evaluate, then ideate once more, etc., like this loop, which is very well known for game designers, is to remix a game. So I grab a game that they all know, like something very simple, I don't know, like Scotland Yard or something. And then we say, okay, everybody knows this game. All right. I put them into groups and I say, remix this game. And I have these, game mechanics cards, like 100 different game mechanics from other games. And I say, just throw these game mechanics at them and see if you can create an entirely new game out of this game. So that's really fun. And then they really play test them with each other, change it again, and, try to make it fun again, but a different game. So fun for a different reason, which is very interesting. Like if you get Scotland Yard or you take Monopoly, and then some group says, we're going to make it collaborative Monopoly. I mean, the craziest things come out. And then they get really excited, like, oh, it's that easy to change a game, right? Then we go to the real world and say, okay, now we're going to change the rules or the parameters of the game of your work. So let's take a situation that we can work with. So for instance, a meeting, like a board meeting or whatever. How does that go? What are not only the rules, but also, or more importantly, the unspoken rules of such a situation? Then we're going to reimagine those rules, play test them, evaluate. Isn't this a better way to have meetings? And on and on and on and on. So depending on the need of the client, you can go two directions with this. You can either do it goal-oriented, which is meetings, excuse my French, they suck, and we're not happy with how they go. So let's change the game. But at the end of the session, we should have a better way of doing it. The other approach is something is just not right. We feel we could do different, but we don't really know the criteria of a more successful meeting. Can we just explore, alternate ways of doing this? And maybe we'll, sort of stumble upon a more inspiring way of doing it. So depending on, let's say, the urgency and the need of the client, will go either goal-oriented or more exploration-oriented. And I'll bring, tools. I create my own tools for these sort of workshops accordingly. So, for instance, if you want to be goal-oriented, then okay, at the end of the meeting, let's say, okay, typical example of a workshop I did. So in meetings, it's always the same people that speak up, the ones with the loud mouth. But there's always the more introvert people. There's nothing wrong with introverts, but they do not tend to speak up. And the person hosting the meeting usually does not ask them to speak because he finds those people usually, they seem unengaged. So he's going to usually go John, you have another question. Okay, you go. But this is not really great for inclusivity, right? So if, let's say, the goal is we have to have more inclusive meetings where everybody is heard, then there's something wrong with the rules of that game. It's broken. Then we use what I call rule play. We not role play, but rule play. We play with the rules. So we write out the unspoken rules. So for instance, one unspoken rule is the one hosting the meeting will pass on the right to speak to the next person, right? Like, John, now you talk. John talks, and then that host takes back the word, so to speak. Huh? What if, and we can use a prop for that, a ball. I hand now the ball to you. It's like a talking stick, like you can now talk. What if the rule is before the talking stick gets given back to the host, it has to be passed on 3 times between participants before it is given back? We didn't know if that would work, but we had a feeling that could change things. So we role-played that rule. And what was interesting is then that some person might say, yeah, normally that person never gets the chance to speak. But I always speak to her at the at the coffee machine, and she has brilliant ideas. She just thinks a lot about it, but she doesn't speak up so easily. So I'm going to pass on the stick to her now because I know she has some fantastic ideas, right? Ah, all right. Yeah, I never knew she had so many ideas because, it's always the same people talking and then time is up. So creating, let's say, a ball or a talking stick that can be passed around and an additional rule could already lead to a more, let's say, more diversity in the dialogue. So that's goal oriented, right? You figure out how to achieve that goal of inclusivity. An example of more exploration oriented was a workshop where we played around with the parameters. Like I see a game, there's sort of a mixing panel, like an audio mixing panel. There's certain things we can put on maximum
Yeah.
or minimum. So amount of players, 0 to, infinite, and anything in between, space, the time, the objects, the artifacts, and the rules. Well, the rules isn't really a slider. The rules is probably those 100 buttons that you can turn on and off, like those special effects. So messing around with the control panel, you're like, how is a meeting when you make the space half as big? Or if you remove the chairs or things like that, you get crazy, crazy situations, which actually make those meetings worse. But by exploring what happens, you better understand the effect or the impact of each of these control panel things. And then you can start by going first extreme, like any kid will do, and like just smash on the keys of the keyboard and just make it blast. And you go like, haha, that was funny. But now let's make a new setting because you messed around with them and see if we can do it a different way. One interesting thing was, again, built around a prop, coincidentally, where we did this with some managers in Singapore in an online meeting. And we talked about a glass of water that's always there. So what is an unspoken rule of a glass of water? It's usually that you don't really drink it if you have, like, let's say in a job interview, that was the situation, a job interview. You're sitting in front of two people. How does that go? Well, you get a glass of water. You don't drink it because you don't want to like mess it on your t-shirt. You don't want to mess anything up. So you're very nervous. So you leave the water, right? You're actually thirsty. So, okay, that was one of those rules. What if we mess around with that? Well, let's say take a shortcut to the end of that session. They found out that what is missing in a session is feedback. Like you never really know, am I doing a good job? Are they hearing me? Am I going to get this job? And it makes people really nervous, right? What if the glass of water could be a non-verbal communication tool to show if you're doing good or not? Meaning, if the people hosting it are drinking their water, it means they're losing interest. If the cup is empty, that indicates the end of the meeting and probably that you don't get the job. But if they don't drink their water, that's an indication that you're doing okay. You yourself, obviously, if you want a job, if you don't want a job anymore, you could also drink your water and they know, well, no point talking anymore. But maybe they go halfway and you start adapting, like going, oh, maybe I'm taking this too seriously. I should relax a little bit. And maybe they start getting interest in you again. They might also fill up their glass of water again, So that was just some crazy experiment where we used a glass of water, almost like a thermometer of how the talk is going non-verbally. I mean, nobody's going to do that, right? But what we did achieve by exploring such crazy notions and role-playing them is that in the end, they all agreed, when we do meetings from now on, we do need to address the fact that, there is no communication telling people if they're on the right track or not. And in some companies, they intend to make you super nervous, right? They want to only get the best ones, the people that, they freak you out. I
Top
think
confidence and all that.
like at Heineken, I think they on purpose do some sort of role play where they bring in actors to make you freak out, like the house is on fire, the building's on fire. What do you do? Just to see how you would react. I mean, that's a very specific branch right there, like this banking hardcore. But this was just people in education, that wanted really good people, and they really are interested in what drives you and why you would want this job as a teacher. So they don't want to make you crazy nervous. They want you to actually, speak out. But the only model they have is that one borrowed from management where it's more hardcore. So they started going like, okay, we need to reinvent this game of the job interview. And this really helped them understand the parameters and what was
Amazing.
needed.
Thank you for that, Bruno. And Bruno, if after hearing these interviews, sort of being in the podcast, I know you've heard a few episodes as well. Is there somebody that comes to your mind that you say, well, I would really like to listen to this person answering these questions on Professor Game?
Yes. And the most obvious answer is Sebastian Deterding, and I think almost everybody you interviewed said that at some point, because I'm just a big fan of everything he does. But I guess I've heard all his talks and read many of his papers so many times that I would be very specifically interested in the when have you failed question. But since I don't want to be, that obvious, I was thinking who else? And one person that I am really interested to hear more from would be Johanna Koljonen. And so she's a Nordic LARP critic. She's a writer, apparently also a TV host. I didn't know that before. Had to look it up. And she's a popular lecturer. So there is a Nordic LARP channel where she features occasionally and talks about, what are the underlying design principles of a good Nordic LARP. And for those of the listeners who don't know what a Nordic LARP is, I mean, LARP is a live action role play, but Nordic LARP is interesting because it's very serious. There are Nordic LARPs that intend to give you an experience of sadness or mourning. Or I've been in some of these LARPs where, the players cry because they start to realize what it means to lose a loved person. And this is not what you immediately think of when you think of a LARP. You think of, witches, people dressed up as witches running around, the forest. But this is so LARP. Well, you have LARPs that make you feel good and that make you feel sad, basically. There's like two flavors. But I'm really interested in those that really let you experience, okay, let me give you one example of a Dutch LARP writer. I can't get the name right now, but I should be able to give you a link for later on in the comment section. And she created a game called Old and Wise. And what it did is you get a list of things that go wrong when you start to get old. Like you lose hearing, you cannot hold your pee anymore, you cannot walk anymore, you grow deaf. But everybody got a list of those, like a random pick of a bigger list that exists, based on reality, but mixed up in different order. And then they act out a role play with almost minimal. Nordic LARP usually doesn't need a lot of props. Like you just put on a hat, and that means putting on a role. It's also very important that you can take off the hat, so you can take off the role whenever you want for safety reasons, emotionally. And then every time they play a song, that means it's another day. And that could be the next day or 1 year later. It doesn't really matter. It's just sort of a feeling of time passing. It's a song Old and Wise that they play then. And that's a key, because then you quickly look at your list and you check off the next thing that is going to be wrong with you. So, for instance, I started out with not being able to walk. So the next day that the song played, I had to stay in my seat. Then suddenly I became blind. And since, you improvise what that day looks like in an old people's home. And so there was some puzzle pieces there. So I pretended to always do a puzzle. And then I was blind, so I pretended to do a puzzle with my eyes closed. But you also act as if this is a normal day. So you bond with other people. But then suddenly that one person, for instance, dies on their list. It's just, you die. So you get out of the game. So then you feel like, oh, wow, I just lost my best friend. How does that feel? More interestingly, even, and I thought that was quite a kind of sneaky, but really, really good, is they had some other people invited and they pretended to play the children of these elderly people. So, and they came in 3 times. At sort of random moments. The first moment they would come in and they would just visit their grandma and go like, oh, how are you doing, grandma? La, la. The second time they would go in, and I think this is really based on reality, right? They came in and they were just always on their phone. So the grandma plays a role and she gets annoyed. Like, why the hell are you constantly on your phone? I'm here, you're visiting me, right? And then the third time she gets a call from him and he says, I'm sorry, I don't really have time to come and visit you anymore. Like I'm too busy with my career, etc. So you really step into the shoes of an elderly people, but with such simple mechanics and so little, props and whatever. It was just in a boring, empty room, but your mind makes it real, like the Cinematrix. Like you really feel,
you step into it.
You really go through that, and I've seen people crying like their eyes out. I've also seen players that said, "Well, they didn't do anything for me." I did it because I once invited her back to do this with my students in gamification course. And, I had one of those tough guys, like, this doesn't do anything with me. It's just a game. It's not real. I met that person 3 months later and I said, so how are you doing? He said, you know that game we played? He said, he said, my grandma got sick and I went to visit her. And when I sat down, that entire experience I had clicked back. Because, your brain doesn't understand the difference between a played experience and a real experience. It all goes into your memory. It's the same memory
Yeah,
database.
true.
It's just something in your brain says, no, that wasn't the real thing. But you felt it, and those emotions get stored somewhere. And they all came out again. And he was like, I finally got how she felt. Like, I didn't know that. It just came back out, and he was completely shocked by the experience and really connected heavily with his grandmother. And I think that is beautiful if you can do that. And
Amazing.
this is just a Nordic LARP. I mean, you play this for entertainment purposes, but you can easily see how you can take some of these principles and use that for training purposes, like to really get people that are maybe 20 years old who go into healthcare to speed up the process of them understanding how these elderly people actually feel.
Great. That's actually a pretty interesting example of how games can be used for different purposes. So thank you for that one as well, Bruno.
Yeah, and Johanna Koljonen should be able to give a lot more interesting examples of this, I think.
Sure. We'll see if we can get her on. And talking about recommendations, do you have any book that you would recommend? You were talking at the start that you read a book and then started playing things around. Like, is there any book that you would recommend in an audience like this one of engagers who are looking for, engaging their audiences, their students, et cetera, et cetera? Or it could be just inspiration or directly related, whatever you want to go for.
A book that I think is a must-read, especially for gamifiers that still really feel that punishment and reward is the way to go, or let's say they won't say punishment, but at least reward, is this fantastic book by Alfie Kohn, and it's called Punishment by Rewards. And immediately after that, I also read Unconditional Parenting, about how we raise our children, and that was really, I mean, there's a lot of people in gamification already know, well, we should go beyond points, badge, leaders, boards, that sort of thing. But nobody knows really where else to go, I suppose, at least not from the older generation. And then he is basically explaining in such a clear and, really backed up with a lot of evidence way that punishment and reward are both equally bad. Like, reward is just a form of punishment. And that, we should focus on intrinsic motivation instead of extrinsic motivation. I mean, we all know that already. But that there's still, I think, when you read his book, he challenges us to really go beyond, competition, being a winner. He even wrote a book that I haven't read yet, like Against Competition, and to look beyond that. And especially the book Unconditional Parenting really, I think, brings home the message that what we do with gamification, if we put rewards and punishment, is we're focusing too much on changing the surface behavior, but not on building the underlying strong relationships. And it's those strong relationships that we need in teamwork, that we need when we want to fix, complex problems in our society. And it sounds maybe a little bit vague, but I think in our society, we're still stuck with some of these really old ideas that, it's about winning. You cannot trust other people. Do it for yourself, have the winner mentality. But now that a lot of smart people, not only him, but especially him, have busted this myth that this is what people are like, then the question comes to mind, how do you make a game that isn't about competition, but about, for instance, love and care? Maybe this LARP I just described could be an example. Can that be done? And I think that there's a lot of territory ready for all of us, which actually brings me to another book. Maybe my biggest hero is Bernie de Koven. I don't know if you heard of him, but he wrote the fantastic book, The Well-Played Game. And he even... I found one article where he took chess, a very typical competitive game, and came up with multiple ways to play chess without being competitive, but still super fun. And it blew my mind. It blew my mind not so much because he can come up with so many solutions. I think all of us actually can. But it blew my mind that he could just easily put aside this idea that if a game is not competitive, it's not going to be as fun ever as when it is competitive. It's just like, no, let's prove that wrong. And then, like a child, very playfully, just comes up with 100 different ideas, just like that, So he has this new book. I mean, he sadly passed away, but he has this book called The Infinite Playground, which came out after he died, which is all about the power of our imagination. And it's really about wondering what if and not being bothered with what we think is true. So if game thinking is about, changing the rules of the games we play every day with one another, I think his legacy is have a license to always change the rules of the game whenever it stops being fun or fair. He's well known for saying, like, it's about playing well together, not about the rules of the game. The rules of the game are there for us to play well together. If we're no longer playing well together, you shouldn't kick the players out. You should kick the rules out, right? Like
There you
adapt
go.
the game, not the players. And if we can make that at the core, I think, of how we approach gamification or game thinking or gameful design or whatever you want to call it, I think then we're really onto something. And I think he proved that there are so many different ways to create, engaging, fair, fun interactions between people that really get them intrinsically motivated, that are not stuck with the idea of competition. Then if he can come up with them, then we all should be able to come up with them. And I think, the time is right for that.
Amazing. Amazing. And finally, we would like to know, in that same tone of recommendations, we'd like to know, Bruno, what would you say is your favorite game?
Board game or video game?
Up to you.
All right. Well, I would say video game then, although I'm also totally into board games. But have you heard of the game Subnautica? It's a game by the company called Unknown Worlds.
Subnautica.
Subnautica. No? So basically, how to describe it? So you find yourself on, well, a spaceship fell down onto a planet. You're in the water. You're in this sort of capsule that broke off from the spaceship that's lying a bit further down, burning. And you have no idea what to do. It has that same thrill as when you first played, like when I played the beta of Minecraft, that you don't know what's going on. Nobody tells you what to do, which is actually not so common anymore in games. Usually it has some sort of pop-up that tells you what to do. So you're just there. And then so you leave the pod and you see all these strange alien fishes and you're like, I don't know what's dangerous or not. So you go back into the pod, oh, well, now what? I guess I'll have to go out there, in there. Then it becomes dark soon enough. Oh, it's even dark. Oh, some fishes glow up in the dark. Oh, that's really creepy. Well, you're starting to get hungry. You're starting to get thirsty. You don't know what to do. And that's where the adventure starts. So you have to just dive in the water and figure it out. I won't, no spoilers here, but I really hugely enjoyed playing it because it got me back to that excitement of the original Minecraft without the added goals and Ender Dragon and all that sort of stuff. There's even something even more interesting, and I want to apply this to education one day, which is this idea of not non-linear storytelling, but multilinear storytelling. So there's a great talk from Charlie Cleveland, the game director. It's a GDC talk about the design of Subnautica, where he really analyzes the entire design process. I would just say watch it. And he basically describes how you can design for a beginning, a mid, and an end game, but that every player can go through it in a completely different way, but will still sort of follow a path. But it's not linear, but it's also not random. Well, I guess watch the talk. But how he does that is literally the reason why I felt the game was so great. How I found it feels, okay, let's put it this way. It feels in the game as if you're creating your own goals. Like you set your own goals and then they become very interesting goals. Like you become intrinsically motivated to say, what if I collect all these? What if I would follow up on these weird transmissions? What if I'm going to make that my goal? But nobody tells you that you have to do it. And if you don't do it, you can still do other stuff. And so they're not like quests and side quests. They're like storylines you can either dip into and follow along or not, or do them all at the same time, or don't do any of them and just keep swimming. And that gives you a feeling that there's such a, everything is new. You want to learn. Everything is unknown. So it's entirely curiosity driven and you set your own goals. And I want that back in education, that you are curiosity driven again in education. And
cool.
Anybody out there that is saying, okay, there must be somebody that says, okay, we'll drastically, completely re-envision our school curriculum. I'm sure there's hundreds of you or not. But anyway, I'll deconstruct Subnautica again and see how you can translate that to school curriculum design. I would love to.
Amazing. So engagers out there, before we take off, if you want to get in contact with Bruno, how can we find out more about you? If you have any quick final piece of advice before we say it's game over for today.
You can always email me. brunosetola@gmail.com is the easiest. And LinkedIn. Just message me on LinkedIn, Bruno Setola. My phone number, I think, will actually be on the website, so you can just call me anytime.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Bruno, for so many insights, for investing your time today with the engagers, for your experience, all your advice, all the things that you gave away today, so to speak. However, engagers and Bruno, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it's fantastic to have you around, and this podcast makes sense thanks to you. So we'd like to know if you want more future interviews with guests like Bruno. If so, please go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list for free. That way we can be in contact. You'll be the first to know of any opportunities that we at Professor Game might have for you. And of course, remember, before going on to your next mission, before pressing continue, remember to subscribe or follow, whatever that looks like in your favorite podcast app. Do it, it's for free, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.